I was born in New York City, but I grew up in Moscow, Russia. And in Moscow, Russia, we have a beautiful subway system. Each station is different, and most of them are glorious. It's the palace of the proletariat. There's only one problem. These beautiful stations are all covered with hammers and sickles. I was always puzzled by this as a kid. I grew up hearing horror stories about the USSR from my relatives who had lived through it. I knew the symbol had been on the flag of the Soviet Union and was supposed to stand for proletarian solidarity. But I also knew that Stalin had used it and that Stalin had killed millions and millions of people in the purges and the famine. To me, this was a symbol of mass murder. It was like the Russian swastika. So I didn't understand why the hammer and sickle was allowed to just be on everything in modern Russia. Hello, my name is Anya, and as always, I am happy you're here. This is a video about the hammer and sickle, and about the people who suffered under the hammer and sickle, and about why we shouldn't use this symbol anymore. Some of the images in this video are too graphic for YouTube, so I've had to blur them out. But you can access the full uncensored version of this video on my Patreon, link in the description below. So, when I moved back to New York, I started using the New York subway, which is full of decay and dysfunction, but I thought, well, at least there are no hammers and sickles here. But eventually I realized that there actually are lots of hammers and sickles in the US and elsewhere, just like there are in the Moscow subway. I realized that a lot of Americans and Western Europeans don't see anything terrible in the hammer and sickle. Plenty use it as a symbol of their leftist politics. Some have it in their Twitter handles. Some people even get tattoos with it. I'm a leftist, and I get especially bothered when I see people like Hassan Piker, who is a super famous leftist political commentator whose content I really enjoy and whose opinions I respect a lot, using the hammer and sickle like there's nothing wrong with that. Because leftists are the last people that should be using the hammer and sickle. But I'll get to that a bit later. Then there's the tankies, of course, left-wing extremists who like the hammer and sickle but also really like Stalin. But they're a fringe online community that few people take seriously, so they don't matter as much to this video. Other people use the hammer and sickle less as a political symbol and more just for the edgy aesthetics. Kim Kardashian wore it on a sweatshirt, for example. This sweatshirt costs $800, by the way. The hammer and sickle also pops up in plenty of memes and jokes, including very bad jokes. For example, this hammer and sickle t-shirt literally makes fun of the Soviet famines. It says, "Dark humor is like food. Not everyone gets it." The joke is that millions of people died of hunger. To me, all of this is in pretty bad taste. The historian Anne Applebaum, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her book on Soviet labor camps, also thinks that this flippant attitude towards the hammer and sickle is weird. She describes walking through a touristy part of Prague and seeing people buying Soviet souvenirs. She writes, "The sight struck me as odd. Most of the people buying the Soviet paraphernalia were Americans and West Europeans. All would be sickened at the thought of wearing a swastika." None objected, however, to wearing the hammer and sickle on a t-shirt or a hat. The lesson could not have been clearer. While the symbol of one mass murder fills us with horror, the symbol of another mass murder makes us laugh. So Applebaum calls the hammer and sickle a symbol of mass murder and compares it to the swastika. A lot of people would really strongly disagree with that statement. But I believe personally that even though the hammer and sickle was not supposed to represent mass murder, it can't not represent mass murder after what happened. Under this flag, in the Soviet Union, at least 2.7 million people were worked to death in the Gulag labor camps and another million executed by firing squad, all for having political opinions. And these, by the way, are the most conservative numbers. These are the numbers the literal Soviet secret police provided. So it's safe to assume that the real numbers are much higher. Under this flag, between 5 and 10 million people starved to death in the famine of 1930-33. This was an artificial famine. It was created by bad Soviet policy and mismanagement and corruption. It didn't happen because of some natural disaster that no one had any control over. It was man-made. Ukraine was especially hard hit by the famine. 4 million people died there in just a year. And there's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that the reason the famine was so much worse in Ukraine than in many other republics was because Soviet officials were intentionally starving Ukrainian farmers to make them more obedient and less rebellious, calm them down with hunger. This was also the flag under which the Soviets, along with the Allies, beat the Nazis. This is 1945. The Soviets have just taken Berlin and are raising the hammer and sickle flag over the Reichstag. But Stalin's way of waging war was throwing bodies at the problem. He and the rest of the Soviet military command did not care about the lives of Soviet soldiers. They used them as meat barricades. That explains why the USSR lost millions more military than other countries that participated in World War II. The estimates vary wildly, but for example, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, the Germans lost 3.5 million military, the Americans lost 380,000 military, and the Soviets lost 11 million military. In the USSR, people used to say, "Где серп и молот, там смерть и голод," which means, where the hammer and sickle is, there is death and famine. This expression speaks to the hypocrisy that Soviet people recognized in the hammer and sickle. The USSR was planned as a socialist state, a workers' state, but in reality it ended up being a single-party dictatorship in which the proletariat class had little real access to power. You know, the hammer was supposed to represent the industrial workers and the sickle was supposed to represent the peasants, the beloved proletariat. But we just saw what was happening to the peasants. They were being raided, deported, and starved. As Applebaum puts it, quote, "These events have not filtered into Western popular consciousness. Stalin's crimes don't inspire the same visceral reaction as do the crimes of Hitler. The general Western public just is not aware of USSR history, at least not to the degree that they're aware of the Holocaust." Applebaum lists many reasons for why this is the case. One is that European communism existed a lot longer than the Nazi regime and, quote, "did grow less reprehensible with time." Two is a lack of records. Soviet archive data isn't always trustworthy, and many atrocities were never recorded at all. Quote, "Access to campsites was forbidden. No television cameras ever filmed the Soviet camps or their victims, as they had done in Germany at the end of the Second World War." Three, and three follows from two here, real Soviet history hasn't been properly represented in Western mass media. Quote, "There's just nothing as ambitious as Schindler's List or Sophie's Choice about the Soviet Union. The endless list of cartoon Soviet baddies in American TV and movies does not count."
How do you Soviets deal with all the tension and stress? Vodka.
4, the Western left relies on the very same Marx and Engels, which makes it harder for them to condemn Soviet communism. Meanwhile, the US right was so overzealous in villainizing Soviet communism
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many.
that they almost made it more attractive to the US anti-establishment left. And finally, there's the problem of collaboration between the USSR and the Allies in World War II. To paraphrase Applebaum, it's not pleasant to have to admit that to defeat one mass murderer, you had to ally yourself with another. I'm pretty sure that if the true history of the USSR was better known, attitudes towards the hammer and sickle would be very different. Certainly, tourists would stop buying souvenirs with the hammer and sickle. But what about the leftists that still use the hammer and sickle as a sincere symbol of their politics? Many of these people are more aware of Soviet history, but still think that using the symbol is okay.
The Hassanavi Nation flag, hammer and sickle.
I've talked to several people like this, and here are the arguments they typically present. The ideology argument. You compared the hammer and sickle to the swastika. That is just not a correct comparison, because these two symbols are inherently different. That is true, because Nazism has evil built into it. The core idea of Nazi ideology is that some people are born better than others, and that the better races need to violently oppress the inferior ones. Marxism, which communism is based on, is pretty much as far as you can get from that. It says that everyone is born equal, and then the system makes them unequal through class oppression. And the end goal of the proletarian revolution is equality. So, the swastika would be evil even if it was completely separate from the Holocaust. And the hammer and sickle, separated from the atrocities that were committed in its name, is not. But how can it be separated? And should it be separated? Isn't that an insult to the memory of the millions of people who had their lives ruined or were killed by people wearing hammers and sickles? There are other counter-arguments too. The "it used to be different" argument. Yes, atrocities were committed under both symbols, but even the swastika is still used in certain countries, like India, because it's actually an ancient religious symbol with an original positive meaning. True, But unlike the swastika, the hammer and sickle does not have a long history. It was created in 1917 and adopted by the Bolsheviks not long after. And even in those early years, long before Stalin's purges, atrocities were already being committed. There was the Red Terror, when bourgeoisie was indiscriminately slaughtered, and there was the 1920s famine, which was made worse by the Bolsheviks because of collectivization and the Civil War. So the hammer and sickle was never a symbol of pure, benevolent communist ideals. The whataboutists argument. Okay, sure, but atrocities were committed under plenty of other flags as well. Look at the British flag, all the colonial violence tied to it. But you're not going around telling people to not use the Union Jack. Well, first of all, maybe some people do want to see less of the Union Jack. I don't know enough about colonial history to make a judgment here, but maybe the Irish have a thing or two to say about this, or the Indians, or all the other ex-colonies. Also, unlike Britain, the Soviet Union no longer exists, so you would think that'd make it easier to stop using the hammer and sickle. It's not on the flag of any state anymore, although, of course, there are dozens of political parties that still use it. But they aren't the topic of this video, because it's not like I can directly address the CCP from my 50,000 subscriber YouTube channel. The reclamation argument. What about the people who are using the hammer and sickle in an effort to reclaim it? That's what Gen Z is doing with it. Like, look at this ID article. For teen communists, the symbol born from Soviet rule represents unity rather than the violent Stalinist regime. Look, this is just not how reclamation works. When we talk about reclamation, we talk about people who suffered a historical wrong taking ownership of the weapons used against them. Like when black people use the N-word or gay people use the F-word. They're taking something that was used to hurt them and giving it a new meaning. But an American teeny bopper leftist born in 2002 is not reclaiming the hammer and sickle because they were never hurt by the hammer and sickle. At the end of the day, using the hammer and sickle as a symbol of socialism or its subtype communism is just bad branding. If you're serious about making socialism popular, why would you use a symbol that has a legacy of mass murder attached to it, and that has actual bans against it in multiple countries? There are many other leftist symbols to pick from, like the socialist fist and rose, the anarchist A, and the social democratic 3 arrows. Or we could just come up with a new symbol for socialism. For example, a honeybee. Bees are very socialist, as far as I understand, and they produce delicious honey, and all the ecosystems seem to be tied to them. So I vote honeybee.
But the union makes us strong.
On a personal note, apart from all the stuff I mentioned above, the reason the hammer and sickle bothers me so much is that it's connected to what's wrong with Russia today. Because you might say, why are you so obsessed with a symbol? Why aren't you focusing instead on Russia's military aggression in Ukraine? But those two things are connected. The reason the hammer and sickle is still all over Russia today, including even on the logos and on the uniforms of Russia's main airline, is because there was no proper accountability taken after the Soviet Union fell. There was no lustration, there was no proper government effort to have the victims remembered. Khrushchev did do some de-Stalinization, but his work was never finished. And that, in my opinion, is a big reason why democracy never got a chance to properly take hold in Russia, and why Russia ended up slipping back into authoritarianism. It's a huge cliche when people say that history that is forgotten is bound to repeat itself, but I think in this case it is true. It's not that Russia has become Soviet, absolutely not, it hasn't, but it has become militaristic and cultish, and civil rights and freedom of speech are again severely limited. And the government and people's general tendency to sweep over the horrors of Soviet history certainly played a part in Russia's regression. But I am hopeful that the history of the Soviet Union will become better known to the general public and that the victims of the USSR will get proper remembrance. There are some wonderful organizations, most notably Memorial, that work on remembering the victims of repressions and the purges. And it's thanks to the efforts of people who do exactly this kind of work that Russia will one day become a free country that doesn't wreak havoc on its neighbors and that respects its own citizens. That's it, guys. Thank you for watching this somber video. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, if you want to support my work, please like and subscribe, and please consider becoming a patron. Patrons get perks. For example, you get your name in the end credits of every video, and you get access to uncensored versions of some of my videos. And here are the lovely patrons.